The storm came down from the mountains without warning, thick and heavy, blotting out the sky and turning the world into a wall of white. Thomas had lived alone in the cabin for years and knew the signs of danger, which was why he was already reinforcing the door with an extra beam when the wind began to howl like a living thing. Snow slammed against the walls, and the fire inside struggled, popping and hissing as if it sensed the cold trying to claim the room. Just as Thomas finished securing the last latch, a sound cut through the storm, 3 faint knocks, uneven and desperate. He froze, listening. No one traveled in weather like this. Another knock followed, weaker than the first, and then a voice, thin and shaking, slipped through the cracks in the door. "Please, I'm freezing. Let me in, I beg you." Thomas stepped closer to the window, wiping frost from the glass with his sleeve. Outside stood a woman, barely upright, her dark hair tangled and crusted with ice. She wore only a torn shawl that did nothing to shield her bare feet from the snow piling around her ankles. Her face was pale with cold, but her eyes burned with an intensity that unsettled him. "This is no place for you," Thomas called, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "You should have sought shelter hours ago." The woman lifted her hand and pressed her palm against the door, leaving behind a strange warmth that seeped through the wood. "If you let me in," she said, "I will reward you. I swear it. The poor may have nothing, but our promises are true." Her words carried a weight that made Thomas's chest tighten, as though the storm itself were listening. His instinct screamed danger. He had heard stories of spirits walking in winter storms, testing the hearts of men. Yet as he watched her shiver, teeth chattering violently, something stronger than fear took hold. He unlatched the door. The wind roared as it opened, but the moment she crossed the threshold, the sound died suddenly. The fire flared bright without being touched, and the biting cold retreated as if chased away. The woman collapsed to her knees, breathing deeply, and whispered, "You have chosen kindness." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, warmth and unease settled together, and Thomas knew his life had just changed. The woman remained close to the fire, as though the warmth might vanish if she stepped too far away. Thomas set a pot of water to boil and offered her a bowl of thin stew, all he had left from the week. She accepted it with both hands, nodding in gratitude, her fingers trembling so badly that some of the broth spilled onto the floor. "My name is Nayeli," she said softly after a few careful sips. "I come from the Apache people, from a place that no longer exists." Her voice held no bitterness, only a quiet exhaustion that made Thomas listen more closely than he meant to. As the wind battered the cabin walls, Nayeli spoke of her journey. Raiders had burned her village, scattering the survivors into the mountains. She had walked for days with little food, guided only by instinct and the belief that someone would open a door for her before the cold claimed her life. "When you have nothing," she said, staring into the flames, "your word becomes your wealth. A promise is all the poor can truly give." The fire crackled strangely at her words, sending sparks spiraling upward, though no log had shifted. Thomas asked what kind of reward she could offer, immediately regretting the question. Nayeli turned to him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "That depends on your heart," she replied. "Some men hear reward and think of gold. Others think of protection. The spirits hear everything." Her reflection in the iron kettle seemed to blur, as though the air around her bent in ways that made his eyes ache. That night sleep came heavily. Thomas dreamed of snow melting into rivers of light, of roots twisting aside to reveal something hidden beneath the earth. He awoke before dawn to the smell of smoke and fear, only to find the fire perfectly contained and Nayeli standing beside it, untouched by the heat. She seemed stronger now, her shoulders straight, her face no longer grey with cold. At first light, Thomas opened the door and stared in disbelief. A freshly dressed deer hung from the beam outside his cabin, its meat unspoiled, the snow beneath it undisturbed by footprints or blood. No hunter could have done this in the storm. When he turned back inside, Nayeli met his eyes. "A small return for warmth freely given," she said. "Remember this, Thomas. Greed breaks promises. Kindness seals them. The words settled deep in his chest, heavier than fear, and he understood that whatever bargain he had entered, it was far from finished. The change did not go unnoticed. By the second day after the storm eased, smoke rising steadily from Thomas's chimney drew curious eyes from neighboring cabins miles away. People came with questions first, then with suspicion. They saw Nayeli sitting quietly near the fire, her posture calm, her eyes alert, and whispered among themselves once they stepped back into the snow. Some laughed, calling her a wandering beggar who had fooled a lonely man. Others warned Thomas that he was inviting trouble by sheltering a woman who arrived out of a blizzard with no tracks behind her. That evening, as dusk bled into night, one of them returned. His name was Carter, a man hardened by drink and bitterness, his voice loud even before the whiskey loosened his tongue. He pushed his way inside without waiting for permission, the cold rushing in with him, his gaze locked onto Nayeli and his mouth twisted into a grin. "So this is the one handing out miracles," he sneered. "If she's paying for shelter, I'll take my share." Thomas stepped between them, but Carter shoved him aside and reached for Nayeli's arm. The room seemed to dim, the fire shrinking low as if starved of air. Nayeli rose slowly to her feet. There was no fear in her expression, only sadness, deep and ancient. "You were not freezing," she said quietly. "You asked without need, and you took without mercy." Carter laughed once, sharp and cruel, then froze mid-sound. Frost spread across his coat, climbing his chest and throat in a breath's time. His eyes widened as ice sealed his lips. When Thomas dragged him outside in panic, the night swallowed the sound of his terror. By morning, Carter's cabin stood encased in ice, windows opaque, door fuse shut, silence locked inside. Thomas returned to his own cabin shaking, guilt and fear battling in his chest. Nayeli knelt by the fire, feeding it gently with a single stick of wood. "This is not punishment," she said without looking at him. "It is balance. Warmth given freely multiplies. Warmth demanded becomes a debt." Thomas sank onto a stool, realizing then that every act, every intention was being counted. The shelter he had offered was more than kindness. It was a test, and as the wind howled outside once more, he understood that the storm had never truly left. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as though reluctant to release what it had claimed. The snow around the cabin thinned into dull grey patches, and the wind no longer screamed through the trees, but whispered instead. Nayeli moved differently now, lighter, as if she were no longer bound to the cold that had once nearly killed her. One morning, Thomas found her standing at the open door, gazing toward the mountains with an expression that carried both longing and peace. He knew then that her time there was ending. "I think the world is calling you back," he said quietly. Nayeli turned and smiled, a smile filled with gratitude and something deeper, older. "Yes," she replied. "The promise has been kept." Thomas felt a sudden tightness in his chest. In the weeks since she had arrived, the cabin had felt less like a refuge and more like a living place, warmed not only by fire but by presence. "And my reward?" he asked, unsure whether he truly wanted an answer. Nayeli stepped closer and placed her hand over his heart. It was warm, steady, human. "You were rewarded the moment you opened your door," she said. "Kindness given without certainty changes the path of a life." Outside, the air shimmered faintly, frost lifting from the ground in curling wisps. Thomas blinked, and for a moment he saw her not as a weary traveler, but as something shaped by wind and memory, woven from loss and promise. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. It no longer looked torn, but gleamed softly, like moonlight caught in cloth. At the threshold, she paused. "There will always be those who knock," she said. "Not all of them will deserve warmth, but you will feel the difference." Then she stepped into the pale morning light and walked forward until her form thinned with the mist and vanished, leaving no footprints behind. Years passed. Thomas grew older, but his cabin never fell into ruin. The fire burned easily, even in the harshest winters. Travelers lost in storms somehow found their way to his door, and he never turned them away. Some swore they heard a woman's voice on the coldest nights, carried on the wind, whispering words of thanks. Thomas would sit by the fire, listening, knowing that the true reward was not gold or protection, But a promise kept, one that ensured he would never stand alone in the cold again.